The old farmhouse sat on a patch of land that felt forgotten, even by the surrounding woods. Miles from the nearest town, its isolation was precisely what Sarah and Tom had craved when they bought it. They were weary of the city's relentless hum, the constant blare of sirens, the suffocating closeness of neighbors, and the pervasive sense of being perpetually connected and yet utterly alone. This farmhouse, with its peeling paint and sagging porch, promised a different kind of life, one rooted in the earth, in quietude, in the simple rhythm of nature. It was a chance to breathe air that didn't taste of exhaust and ambition, to raise their daughter, Lily, away from the constant digital noise and the pressures of urban life. Black Creek ran sluggishly at the edge of their property, a dark, winding ribbon that gave the place its name, its presence a quiet promise of cool water and hidden life. The first few weeks were idyllic, a honeymoon phase with their new, old home. The silence was a balm, a luxurious absence of noise they hadn't realized they craved so desperately. It was broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the cheerful chirping of crickets at dusk, and Lily's delighted squeals as she chased iridescent butterflies through the overgrown meadow that stretched behind the house. They spent their days in a flurry of activity, unpacking boxes filled with their old life, painting the sun-drenched kitchen a cheerful yellow, and exploring the dusty corners and hidden nooks of the old house, uncovering forgotten relics of past inhabitants. The house smelled of aged wood, damp earth from years of rain, and something else, something faint and vaguely metallic, like old pennies or dried blood, which they dismissed as just the accumulated scent of an old, neglected building. The change started subtly, like a shadow lengthening imperceptibly across the floor. The silence began to feel less like peace and more like a heavy blanket, pressing down on them, muting the world outside. The woods, which had initially seemed inviting, a place for exploration and adventure, now loomed, their shadows deepening too quickly at dusk, swallowing the light with an unsettling eagerness. Lily, usually a ball of boundless energy who would play outside until called in for dinner, became withdrawn. She stopped venturing far from the house after sunset, her small body often found pressed against the living room window, her eyes fixed on the tree line with an unnerving intensity that seemed too old for her 6 years. "What's wrong, sweetie? Why aren't you playing outside?" Sarah asked one evening, her voice soft with concern, finding Lily in her usual spot by the window, her small face pale and drawn in the fading light. Lily didn't turn, her gaze unwavering. "The quiet," she whispered, her voice barely audible, barely more than a breath against the glass. "It's listening." Tom and Sarah exchanged worried glances over Lily's head. Kids had active imaginations, they told themselves, clinging to the rational explanation. New place, new sounds, new fears. It was just a phase. But the feeling of being watched, of the stillness outside the windows holding its breath, waiting, began to creep into them too, a cold, unsettling sensation that settled deep in their chests. Then came the sounds, escalating from subtle to undeniable. Not loud, sudden noises that could be easily explained away, but soft, deliberate ones that seemed designed to wear down their nerves. A gentle tapping on the back porch late at night, rhythmic and persistent, too regular to be a branch in the wind. The faint scrape of something rough against the stone foundation, a sound that conjured images of something dragging itself along the ground. And the most disturbing of all, the distinct, sickening crunch of something being stepped on just outside their bedroom window. A sound that made their blood run cold and their imaginations conjure things they didn't want to name. Tom, ever the practical man, armed himself with a flashlight and his skepticism, checking the perimeter every night. He found nothing, no footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed leaves, no broken branches. Just the oppressive silence that seemed to rush in the moment he opened the door, and the lingering, certain feeling that whatever was making the sounds vanished the instant he tried to confront it. It was as if the house itself held its breath, protecting whatever lurked just beyond its walls. One morning, Sarah found a small, intricately carved wooden doll on the back step. Its features were crude, almost tribal, carved with rough, deliberate strokes. Its eyes were two tiny, unsettlingly realistic pebbles, dark and unblinking, that seemed to follow her as she picked it up. Lily swore she hadn't put it there, her eyes wide with genuine fear. They threw it away, deep into the woods, trying to dismiss it as a strange prank or a forgotten toy from a previous owner. But the next day, another appeared, identical to the first, sitting on the same back step. And the day after that, another, always on the back step, always with those unsettling pebble eyes, a silent, persistent message. The metallic smell in the house seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, especially near the basement door. It was a coppery, stagnant odor, thick and cloying, that made Sarah feel nauseous and lightheaded whenever she was near it. It wasn't the smell of rust or old pipes, it was organic, visceral, the scent of blood left to dry and decay. Tom, determined to find the source, went down to investigate, armed with a powerful flashlight and a growing sense of dread. The basement was damp and musty, filled with cobwebs that clung to his face and forgotten junk from decades past. He shone the light into the darkest corners, seeing only spiders scurrying away and dust motes dancing in the beam like tiny, ephemeral ghosts. But the smell was strongest there, clinging to the air like a physical presence, a foul, invisible mist. He found no source, no leak, no animal carcass, nothing to explain the sickening odor. The mystery only deepened the fear. One night, the tapping returned, louder this time, and closer to the house, right against the back wall. It sounded unmistakably like fingernails scraping against wood, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to mock their fear. Sarah and Tom lay in bed, rigid with terror, listening to the unsettling cadence. Down the hall, Lily whimpered in her sleep, her small body trembling even in her dreams. Tom finally snapped, the fear and frustration boiling over. "That's it," he growled, throwing off the covers, his face a mask of grim determination. "I'm going to see what the hell is out there. I can't take this anymore." Sarah grabbed his arm, her voice a desperate plea. "No, Tom, don't. What if it's—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the unspoken possibilities too terrifying to voice. "What? A deer? A raccoon?" He scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction, a thin veneer over his own fear. He pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, grabbed the heaviest flashlight he could find, a large, metal one that felt substantial and real in his shaking hand, and crept towards the back door, each step echoing in the unnerving silence of the house. The moment he stepped onto the porch, the tapping stopped abruptly. The silence rushed in, thick and suffocating, pressing in on him from the dark woods. He swept the powerful beam of the flashlight across the yard, into the impenetrable shadows of the woods, along the dark, still edge of the creek. Nothing, just the wind sighing through the branches and the distant, mournful cry of an owl, a sound that felt less like nature and more like a lament. He stood there for a long time, the cold night air raising goosebumps on his arms, the feeling of being watched more intense than ever. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if something was just inches behind him, breathing the same cold air. He spun around, the flashlight beam cutting wildly through the darkness, but there was nothing. The porch was empty, the yard still, the woods silent and watchful. He went back inside, locking the door with a heavy bolt that felt laughably inadequate. Sarah was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide and questioning in the dim light. "Anything?" Tom shook his head, his face grim and pale. "Nothing I could see, but it was there, I could feel it." The next day, they found something else on the back step. Not a doll this time, but a small, dead bird, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle, its tiny body cold and stiff. Its eyes, cloudy and lifeless, seemed to stare up at them with a chilling accusation. It was a deliberate message, a violation of their space, a cruel display of power. Fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced through their denial, shattering the fragile illusion of safety. This wasn't just an old house settling or harmless wildlife. Something was deliberately leaving these things, escalating its presence, making its intentions clear. Something that knew they were afraid and seemed to feed on it. They started locking all the doors and windows the moment the sun began to dip below the horizon, doubling checking the locks, drawing the curtains tight. They kept the lights on throughout the night, the warm glow a fragile, artificial barrier against the encroaching darkness outside. But the sounds continued, relentless and unnerving. The tapping, the scraping, the soft thudding against the walls, sometimes accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to slither under the doorframes. And the metallic smell in the basement grew almost unbearable, a constant, nauseating reminder of the unseen presence below. Lily's fear was the hardest to witness, the most heartbreaking symptom of the house's effect on them. She refused to sleep alone, clinging to Sarah or Tom throughout the night, her small body trembling even in the safety of their arms. She spoke of whispers in the walls, of shadows that moved in the periphery of her vision, of things that watched her from the corners of the room. "They want me to play," she said one morning, her voice flat and empty, devoid of the usual childish lilt. "Who wants you to play, sweetie?" Sarah asked, her heart clenching with a familiar pang of dread. Lily pointed towards the basement door, her small finger trembling. "The quiet ones, down there, they're waiting." A wave of icy dread washed over Sarah, a sickening confirmation of her deepest fears. The basement, the source of the smell, the place. Lily seemed to sense something ancient and malevolent stirring. Tom, despite his earlier bravado, was visibly shaken, his face etched with exhaustion and fear. He called a local handyman, a gruff old man named Earl who had lived in the area his whole life and knew the land like the back of his hand. He came the next day, a man of few words and calloused hands, his eyes holding a weary knowledge of the world's darker corners. They showed him the dolls, the dead bird, told him about the sounds and the pervasive, sickening smell. Earl listened patiently, his face unreadable, occasionally spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the dry earth. He spent an hour in the basement, his flashlight beam visible through the small, grimy windows like a searching eye. When he emerged, his face was pale under his tan, the usual color drained away, leaving behind a network of weathered lines. "Anything, Earl? Any explanation?" Tom asked, a desperate flicker of hope in his voice. Earl shook his head slowly, his gaze distant and troubled. "Ain't nothing in there that makes that smell. No busted pipes, no dead critter I can find. And them sounds, they ain't natural settling." He paused, looking towards the dark woods and the sluggish creek beyond. "Folks around here, they got stories about this place. About the creek, old stories, go back a long ways." "Stories? What kind of stories?" Sarah prompted, her voice trembling, leaning forward eagerly despite her fear. "They say things got lost in that creek," Earl said, his gaze distant, fixed on the water's edge. "Things that weren't meant to be lost. Things that belonged somewhere else, or nowhere at all. And sometimes the creek gives 'em back, or sends something else out in their place." He looked directly at them then, his eyes, usually sharp and knowing, holding a deep, ancient fear that chilled them to the bone. "This land, it remembers. And it don't forget." He refused to say more, just packed up his tools with a quiet finality and left, leaving them with his cryptic warning and the heavy weight of his fear, a burden they now shared. That night, the sounds were different, escalating beyond the familiar tapping and scraping. It was a low, guttural humming that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, a resonant thrumming that felt less like a sound and more like a physical pressure. It came from the basement, a sound that felt wrong, deeply and fundamentally wrong, a sound that spoke of something ancient and hungry stirring beneath their feet. Tom went to the basement door, drawn by a morbid fascination and a desperate need to understand. His hand shook as he reached for the knob, the metal cold against his skin. "No, Tom!" Sarah cried, grabbing his arm again, her fingers digging into his flesh. "Don't open it, please." But he didn't seem to hear her, his eyes wide and fixed on the door, a strange, trance-like expression on his face. The humming grew louder, a resonant thrumming that filled the house, vibrating in their teeth and bones. Suddenly, Lily screamed, a piercing sound that cut through the humming and their fear. They spun around. She was standing in the hallway, pointing towards the basement door, her small face contorted in pure, unadulterated terror. "It's here," she shrieked, her voice raw and ragged. "It's here, the quiet ones. They're coming for me." The basement door, which had been firmly closed just moments before, slowly, silently, began to swing inward, revealing a black void beyond. The metallic smell intensified, overwhelming their senses, thick and suffocating. It was the smell of old blood, of decay, of something that had been buried for a very long time and was now returning to the surface. A deep, wet slurp echoed from the darkness within the basement, a sound that suggested something large and wet was pulling itself free from something else. Tom stumbled back, pulling Sarah and Lily with him, their movements clumsy with terror. They backed away from the door, their eyes glued to the black void beyond, unable to tear their gaze away. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy and slick being pulled across rough concrete, each scrape sending a fresh wave of nausea through them. A shape began to emerge from the darkness, indistinct at first, a shifting mass of shadow and form that seemed to absorb the faint light filtering from the hallway. As it moved into the weak glow, they saw it. It wasn't a creature they could name, not from any biology or nightmare they had ever encountered. It was a collection of things, fused together in a grotesque, impossible parody of life. Limbs that didn't belong together, twisted and elongated, eyes that stared from impossible angles across its form, reflecting the faint light with a dull, malevolent sheen. A mouth that was a ragged, gaping wound, lined with uneven, bone-like protrusions. It moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, dragging itself forward with a sickening scrape and wet thud. The metallic smell was overpowering now, thick and suffocating, filling their lungs and coating their tongues. It was the smell of it, the smell of whatever ancient, foul thing had been stirring beneath their home. It paused at the threshold of the basement door, its many eyes fixing on them with a chilling, predatory intelligence. A low, wet chuckle emanated from its mouth-like opening, a sound that promised unspeakable horrors. It raised a hand, a malformed collection of fingers and something else, something sharp and bone-like, dripping with a dark, viscous fluid, and pointed a single, elongated digit directly at Lily. "Play," it rasped, the sound like gravel being churned in stagnant water, a sound that seemed to scrape against their very souls. "Play with us." Down here, terror, pure and absolute, seized them, a primal instinct that overrode all thought and reason. They didn't think, they didn't plan. They turned and ran, out the front door, leaving it wide open, into the cold night, the sounds of the thing dragging itself from the basement echoing behind them, a sound that would forever haunt their nightmares. They ran through the dark meadow, the tall grass whipping at their legs, towards the distant, faint glow of the highway, miles away. They didn't look back, they couldn't. The silence of the woods was no longer peaceful, it was a predator, stalking them, its stillness a promise of pursuit, of being surrounded by unseen things. They never returned to the farmhouse. They never spoke of what they saw, not to the police, not to anyone who might listen. How could they? Who would believe them? A story of a house that smelled of blood, of dolls with pebble eyes, of a creature that crawled from the basement? They would be dismissed as crazy, their terror reduced to a shared delusion. They built a new life, far from the woods and the creek. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is quiet, Sarah and Tom hear it. Not with their ears, but with something deeper, something in their bones, a phantom echo of the horrors they left behind. The faint, rhythmic tapping, the soft scrape, the sickening crunch, and the low, guttural humming that vibrates in the stillness, a reminder that some things, once lost, are never truly gone. And some places, like the land by Black Creek, remember everything. And they wait, patiently, in the dark.